Hello, and welcome to this session of Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church. In this winter-spring season of 2021, as we look at the Bible's big stories, both in their telling and in their retellings. In our second unit, we come to the ancestors of the faith, ancestors who are actually shared by Jews and Christians and Muslims in their respective telling of their religious heritage. The ancestors, of course, are introduced to us in the Hebrew Bible, the Bible of the Jewish people originally, and then are picked up by the Christian and Muslim communities because of their presence in the book of Genesis. So we're looking at Genesis chapters 12 through 50, and particularly we'll focus on Genesis 12 through 37. I suspect that it might be helpful just to review the basic genealogy that's presented over the course of these many chapters. It can get a little bit confusing. After all, we go from Abram and Sarai through a number of not only name changes, but also generations. And ultimately, we end up with the 12 sons and one daughter at least of Jacob, Israel. And so let's take a brief look at how this all develops in 4 basic steps. We start off with Abram and Sarai in Ur of the Chaldees, that's southern Mesopotamia, what will later become both Assyria and then subsequently Babylon. And in chapter 12, they are told to get up and leave there and go to a land that God has shown or will show to Abram. And so they move up across the Fertile Crescent and down into the land of Canaan. And most of their story takes place in the land of Canaan, although already in chapter 12, there's a quick little run down into Egypt and then back up to the land of Canaan. Abram and Sarai turn out to be incapable of having children initially. And so in a pattern that is further developed as the story goes along in later generations, Sarai gives her servant Hagar to Abram in order for him to have a child by Hagar. That child is Ishmael, and a bit of a pattern develops in which the question of who is the child of promise and what is the relationship between the elder and younger child become thematic. Well, the child of promise in this case is a child who ends up being born to Sarai, and in fact she is renamed Sarah in advance of that birth, in the announcement that leads to that birth. And so Sarah and Abraham have a son Isaac. In chapter 22, we see the famous scene in which Abraham is called to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he responds to that positively. He takes Isaac to the mountain that God shows him, Mount Moriah, and prepares the sacrifice. And God stays his hand before he slays his son, saying that now it is clear that you trust the Lord. And so a ram is given as the substitute sacrifice for the sacrifice of this firstborn of Abraham and Sarah, although he is not Abraham's firstborn. Again, that theme emerges. So in chapters 12 to 23, the following chapter after the non-sacrifice of Isaac, portrays Sarah's death. And then in chapter 25, verses 1 to 18, we get the narration of Abraham's death and the report of his later marriage to Keturah, and her bearing 6 sons who become clans. But then Abraham dies, and his progeny through Ishmael are also named. So that's our first step. It's about Abram and Sarai, who end up being renamed, and they have the son of promise, Isaac, but Abraham also has a child by Hagar and the 6 children by Keturah. In our second step, we see Isaac, and this is in chapter 24 after Sarah's death, but before Abraham's. And Abraham is concerned about the continuation of the family line. And so he sends his servant to Babylon, back to Ur of the Chaldees, to find a wife for Isaac. And here is the story of Rebekah at the well. She is the granddaughter of one of Abraham's brothers by the name of Nahor, but she identifies herself as often as not as the granddaughter of Milcah, her grandmother. And so in chapter 24, we see that Abraham's servant brings Rebekah back to the land of Canaan for Isaac. In the middle of chapter 25, we see another episode in this second main step, and that is when Isaac and Rebekah have the twins Esau and Jacob, Esau being the older, Jacob being the younger. They're twins, but still Esau emerges first. Jacob comes out grasping at his heel. That may be one of the ways he gets his name. And then we have all the drama of Esau and Jacob. Rebekah's wanting her younger son Jacob to gain his father's blessing, and so the sale of the pot of porridge, etc., etc. Well, then in chapter 28 through the middle of chapter 29, we see the third main step in this genealogy when Isaac sends Jacob back to Babylon, to the ancestral home, because we're told that Rebekah doesn't want Jacob marrying one of the local women in Canaan. So Jacob goes back and lo and behold gets involved with Rebekah's brother, Laban, who has 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. And we get the story in this chapter and a half, almost 2 chapters, of how Jacob ends up working 7 years for Laban's daughter, thinking he's going to marry Rachel, and then he ends up with Leah, the older, but still his heart is really with Rachel, and so he works another 7 years for Laban and is able to marry Rachel. And so we have the third major step, which takes place back in Babylon as the first part of the second step did. All right, now things are going to start to get complicated as the story expands through the end of chapter 29 and through chapter 31, with all of the doings around Laban's household and Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and how it is that they end up among them, along with 2 other women who are the servants of the wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, So Jacob and 2 wives and 2 of their servants, and among them they end up having 12 sons. And we learn later in chapter 35 that there was a daughter as well by the name of Dinah. Well, this is the basic genealogy you can see in the enumeration of the 12 sons, and you've read this in chapters 29 and 30, how sort of complicated it is, but also how it's given as a pretty straightforward genealogy. There isn't a lot of detail about the kids. There's a certain amount of narrative about the back and forth between the 2 wives and with the servants of the wives in terms of how the children are all born. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about this is the way in which the Bible gives us the reason for the names of each of the 12 sons of Jacob. Because this happened or that happened, and so the child was named in relationship to a distinctive characteristic of the birth. We'll come back and take a look again at that a little later and also next week. So the last thing to note about this genealogy is that 11 of these sons are born to Jacob while he is still in Laban's household in Babylon. And then after he returns to Canaan with the whole entourage, and he will have met Esau on his way back into the country and all the drama of their meeting and deciding who's going to live where in the land. And then Rachel conceives again, and it is in childbirth that Rachel dies, and that is the 12th child. This is narrated only in Genesis 35, again, rather briefly, around the topic of her death. But this is the son that she names Benoni, son of my woe. But Jacob names him Benjamin, son of the right hand. So this is the basic picture of the genealogy, complicated as it is, and I imagine that my charts have made it look even more complicated than it is. Perhaps, but a general sense of how we see the family growing from the simplest Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Keturah, and then expanding. But also noting in the red lettered names and in the red lines of descent that there is a line of promise which comes through this. And there are many other progeny in this clan, but a red line of promise which can be traced through and which you've found out is part of the narrative. That's one aspect of this ancestral story that has been suggested as kind of a theme, that despite the fact that there are all kinds of foibles and mistakes and even dishonesty, self-interest, jealousy, all kinds of human dynamics that might get in the way of this promise that God has made to Abram and Sarah, that God finds a way, despite all of that human waywardness, to remain faithful to the promise. And so it does actually continue generation by generation by generation. That's one thought, one suggestion that's been made about a way to understand how all of this material came together. And there's a lot of material here, isn't there? One of the things that we can note is that it seems to be a somewhat composite text. How else would we explain that the ancestor gets involved with a foreign king, offering the ancestor's wife to the king in order to somehow maintain some kind of peace, perhaps, or to save his own skin? There are various motivations given, but we see this story 3 times, right? Genesis 12, it's Abram with Sarai and Pharaoh in Egypt. Genesis 20, Abraham now tries the same thing with Abimelech back in Canaan. And then in chapter 26, as though Abimelech hasn't understood how this family operates, he gets drawn into it again with Isaac and Rebekah. And so the whole, this picture of the same basic story coming through 3 times is one of the ways that suggests that maybe we have a somewhat composite text here. How else, for example, too, would we explain that Jacob is renamed Israel in 2 different places, once in chapter 32, once in chapter 35, under different circumstances? If he's already been renamed in chapter 32, how is it that he still needs to be told of his renaming again in chapter 35? Well, unless the ancestors of Israel, those who passed down these stories, had from 2 different sources, 2 different lines in the family maybe, 2 different accounts of how that happened. And both of them got incorporated into this ancestral history. Why they didn't choose one or the other, that's one of the questions that biblical scholars will ask. What's the significance of that? Or how is it that we can make sense of the 2 tellings in a single narrative? But we have here a somewhat composite text, and that in itself can make for some interesting analysis. One of the suggestions about that is that there are different emphases that are provided. For example, in the ancestor wife story with the foreign king, in Genesis 12, it's been suggested by a scholar by the name of Sean McGevinue, I think that's how he pronounces it. He suggested in chapter 12, it's really about international relations, Abram and the Pharaoh in Egypt, that in chapter 20, the story is told differently. And here it's more about how do we coexist with neighbors in the land together? Not about foreign relations, but about domestic relations between our community and the neighboring community. And then the Isaac and Rebekah story with Abimelech in chapter 26 is really much more about human relations in general. The language there is much more oriented to understanding the internal feelings and the motivations and the interpersonal dynamics of the individuals, not so much as representatives of neighboring clans or neighboring nations, but rather at a much more interpersonal level. So maybe part of what's going on here is that there are different aspects of the character of the nation that the compiler of these stories wants to be able to convey. Another possibility is to take 12 tribes, which all seem to have their own sort of history. Is that where these individual names come from, and get respected by the story by saying, oh yes, Dan, those are the judges, and oh yes, Naphtali, those are the wrestlers, and oh right, Asher, those are the people who are happy. Is there something about a clan character that gets conveyed here? And if these were separate clans at one time who ultimately ended up being drawn together into a single nation, does this story of the ancestors really help to tell the later generations how it is that we're all somewhat related to one another, even though we may have come from different mothers, and even though some of us were born in Babylon, another was born in the land of Canaan. Nevertheless, there's a way to understand how we all came together by telling this story about our ancestors. A couple of things that I would point out that may be have been a little bit surprising to you. One is the really crucial role of women in this ancestral story. I think we have come to understand that biblical Israel and the ancient world in general was a pretty intense patriarchy. And that didn't end with the ancient world. But the main characters all seem to be men until you read this story carefully, and then it's fascinating how many times it is the women who are central to it, who are the main actors in it, who determine the direction in which the story is going to move. So, for example, the promise that God gives about Abram and his seed turns out not to be only about his seed at all, but it also requires that that seed be planted in Sarah, because Hagar cannot be the mother of the child of promise. That has to be Sarah, even though Abram is the father of both of those children. Similarly, I've mentioned that Rebecca is identified pretty much as Milcah's granddaughter, more so than Bethuel's daughter or Nahor's granddaughter. It's that she is the daughter of Bethuel, who was born to Milcah, the wife of Nahor, who was the brother of Abram. So it's Rebecca and Milcah who are the really key connection in that regard. Again, the focus on the women. Also, Rebecca's clear role in getting the blessing to come from Isaac to Jacob rather than Esau. That whole story of how she really engineers what it is that Jacob does in order to get his father's blessing. And then back in Babylon, the drama of Rachel and Leah and their servants and how they become the mothers of these 12 tribes, even if Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes. The way in which Tamar ensures that there is a line which continues from Judah. And in fact, it is through Perez, one of those two children that she bears through the illicit relations with Judah. It is Perez who ends up being the ancestor of King David. So again, it's she with her cunning in trying to ensure that the line continues and that she gets her due according to what Judah had promised, that is the center of the story. So in all of this, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a simple patriarchal tale only populated by men and only moved forward by men's decisions and actions. The women are crucial actors in these stories, and we can't fail to notice that. The other dimension of this, and this one is actually fairly commonly recognized, is the number of times in which the older-younger conflict or switch takes place. So Ishmael's the older child, but Isaac is the child of promise. Esau is the older twin, but Jacob is the twin who carries the blessing forward. Even in the children of Jacob, who ends up being renamed Israel, even among these 12 children of Israel, who are the tribes, If we read on, especially into chapter 37, and then 38, the story of the beginning of the story of Joseph, we can see how Reuben and Judah, the firstborn and the fourthborn, end up kind of vying for primacy. And it is, in fact, Judah, the fourth child in the line, who is the line of promise if that promise is to come to King David. But the fact that that all occurs within a story about Joseph, who is actually 11th in line out of the 12. And in that story, if you've read all the way to the end of chapter 50, Joseph ends up making Benjamin the 12th child, the youngest of them all, sort of the ransom or the pledge that on whom the story turns in order for Jacob Israel to end up coming down into Egypt during the famine. So consistently, the principle that the eldest is the child of promise, the child of privilege, the child of inheritance, and the whole process that's known as primogeniture, and that consistently in this story gets reversed, so that the younger ends up being the primary character in the new generation. There's another dimension to this. All these names and the number of times that people get renamed. Abram and Sarai get renamed Abraham and Sarah. Jacob gets renamed Israel. All of Jacob's children are given names because of something that happens in the course of their birthing. Names are clearly key to this, and it's not just people, it's also places, right? It's the mound of witness, Gal-Aid, between Laban and Jacob. And it's Beth-El, the place where Jacob says, surely this is the house of God. And many other places in these stories where names are significant and their significance is pointed out. So there's that dimension of it as well. And just how many vignettes there are in this. These are the stories that many of us remember from Sunday school because they're so vivid. And there's often a moral to the story, but the moral to the story might be that the ancestor wasn't exactly the most moral person. So there's so much humanity here, so much in terms of human relations, that if you're telling these stories by the fireside in antiquity, sharing the family lore, as it were, who are we because of who our ancestors who were we, what's our character, there is so much on which to hang your hat, so to speak, because of how rich and varied all of these vignettes come together to be. And some of those are the things that get picked up later by other biblical writers that we'll see in the retellings next week. One of the things, and as we near the end here, one of the things that might be worth thinking about, beyond whatever questions you may have or whatever insights have arisen because you read this story again and saw something you haven't seen before, but it's interesting to ask, what does this all come to once it's all put together? I've been naming off different themes that one can focus on or different aspects of it that one can identify. But ultimately, someone or some community decided this set of vignettes with all these different dynamics, they need to be brought together in order to tell a story. And what is that story? I've suggested already that one possibility is that this is the story of God's faithfulness in the face of human waywardness. And that's what all of this is meant to do, is to show that despite the fact that we have a checkered past and ancestors whose stories we may or may not really feel comfortable telling, God remained faithful to a promise and made us a people. Another dimension that one might consider is that this really is about how 12 disparate tribes ultimately ended up as one nation, and how can they understand themselves as somehow related to each other and enjoying the unity of a single clan or family. Maybe that's what it is. Or maybe when we look at the role of women, the central role of women, the inversion of the patriarchy, as you were, and the inversion of primogeniture, that priority of the firstborn, maybe what we have is a group of stories that are intended to tell Israel, to carry on within Israel, or to lay the groundwork within Israel for a tradition of counterculturalism. You see the patriarchy and the right of the firstborn in all these other nations around you. But in our history, our story, our community, we do things differently. We know that in the long run, that didn't finally pan out because patriarchy was the dominant mode for the past 2,500 years. But maybe what we're seeing is a window into a time when biblical Israel understood itself to be living against the grain in that sense and offering something different. And maybe similarly with the question of the priority of the firstborn. Well, so much to look at here, and I look forward to the things that you have discovered as you have had an opportunity to read this ancestral story now as a big story in the Bible, to explore things that may have been raised by my observations here, and to lay the groundwork for seeing how it is that this big story of the ancestors, told in Genesis, will be retold by other biblical writers in our session next week. So look forward to our conversations. God bless.